My name is Frank Kupper, and I am the coordinator of the Rethink project based at the VU University in Amsterdam as an associate professor in science communication and public engagement. And I will tell you a bit about the context of the project, so you understand why we are having this discussion and why we are having this discussion together with you all. An important starting point for our project was the observation that communicating about science in society has become increasingly complex and challenging. And we recognize this every day in discussions around climate change, artificial intelligence and its potential use for face recognition and emotional recognition, for example. But of course, also we recognize it in how we deal with the pandemic and how we deal with scientific information about the pandemic and all the uncertainties and ambiguities that are involved. And our first webinar in this series focused on this aspect, focused on sense making and how we as citizens in our contemporary societies make sense of this pandemic and the role of science communication. Now, of course, the question of quality is very much related to this, because this process of sense making and communicating about science in society has become increasingly complex. And we recognize two different trends that for us were starting points to start working on this question. First was the observation that the boundaries between science and society are blurring. So there is more collaboration, but also more discussion and controversy. And second, there is a rise of digital technologies that are transforming the way we communicate about science. So increasing the number of platforms, channels, actors, which of course has consequences for what is discussed, in what way it is discussed, and who's participating in the discussion. Now, at the in the Rethink project, we want to figure out how these issues, how these trends change. First of all, how people make sense of science, and second, also change the communicative practices of scientists, journalists, and science communicators. So how do these professionals try to tap into these new communication situations that are emerging, and can we do anything to help them achieving their goals? Now, for this, we have set up 7 what we call rethinker spaces, which are located in 7 different European countries that you see here. And they are transdisciplinary hubs. So they bring together researchers on science communication, but also journalists, science communicators, policymakers. And the idea of these rethinker spaces is really to connect research and practice in finding new strategies for these issues that we recognize. And I already saw in the Zoom frames a lot of rethinker space participants that are not only here today, but also help us in constructing this research throughout the project. Our aims at Rethink are therefore, first of all, to get a better idea of how this new science communication landscape works, what it looks like, and how it functions. And this is what Emma Weitkamp from University West of England in Bristol will tell you about more in her presentation that will start in a few moments. And the next step for our project is to develop new and improved ways to communicate science, and also as a third step to produce training resources. And the groundwork for these two aims is the work that Beerte Veenrich has done in her study into the quality of science communication in a digital age that she will talk to you about in a few moments. So just to finish this brief introduction, let me again say that I'm very happy that we are all here. And as Rethink, we also see this webinar as an opportunity to get feedback from you and to learn in our journey together with the Rethinker Spaces to reach these aims that you see here. So again, thank you for your efforts, and I'll give the floor now to the next speaker.
So usually we wanted you to do a little bit of Slido and Padlet work. So maybe we just start with this because we were just interested in to know a bit more about you, and also to know your background in science communication a bit. So our first question would be what basically your relationship to science communication is, and maybe we can use the time until Emma is back, hopefully, to try to bring together some kind of word cloud where you also show your relationship to science so that we can get to know your perspectives better. So Dorina, is it possible that you?
Yes, I will. Yes, I'm sharing the screen. Okay.
So basically, just to get to know you better, we would be interested in what your background in science communication is. Okay, I see scientist, quite big, a lot of professional communication activities, communications officer, science writer, journalist, something else? Did you all manage to get in the tool?
Yes.
Okay. So we had thought about a certain choreography. So therefore, this is we have to rearrange a bit. But I think this is no problem for you. So therefore, my suggestion would be that So our plan was first to have a look at as Frank mentioned, to have a look at the changing science communication landscape and to see how it changes. But now we just jump in the quality theme and have a look at this. And therefore, I'll share my presentation. Can you see this?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, then I'll start the presentation mode. And so in the word cloud, we saw that at least those of you who wrote in there have very, very different perspectives on science communication. And therefore, I would assume that you also have very different perspectives of quality of science communication. So maybe this is a good point to introduce myself. So I'm basically a science communication scholar, so a researcher from Germany. I'm involved in the Rethink project, and I'm currently also involved in another project which is situated at the Academy of Sciences in Berlin, so one of the German science academies, where we also deal with questions of quality in the context of the digital transformation of science communication. So therefore, this is a topic that is quite very, very much in the focus of my work at the moment. And what I'm going to present today is basically research that we did in the context of Rethink, and this is still work in progress, so this has only been partly published yet, but I hope that we can give you some first impressions of what we did and also what we struggled with, because it's, as you will see, not the easiest thing to research on quality. So to start with, I actually would like to start with a very, very fundamental and broad perspective. So Frank already mentioned a bit that we try to research science communication, but I think it's also very good to remind us why we actually talk about science communication. So in the last decades, social sciences have developed a number of diagnoses to describe actual developments of society, which I think are very helpful to get clear what we are actually talking about. And one of these notions that you all know is the notion of the so-called knowledge society that has been used since the 1960s to stress the importance of knowledge, and in particular of scientific knowledge for societal development. So you probably all agree that with the corona pandemic, our dependency on scientific knowledge has become more visible than ever. So we have witnessed how scientific experts have turned into pop stars. We have witnessed how scientific findings and scientifically based recommendations made their way and still make their way into all areas of public life. And against this backdrop, science communication, of course, is considered as a very important basis for societal development, and thus is seen as increasingly societally important. So we will hopefully later on see in Emma's presentation that there's also another development of society and also another societal diagnosis, which is very important to grasp the societal development, and this is a notion of the media or digital society. So accordingly, science communication is confronted with numerous upheavals in the context of the digital transformation. So we have been witnessing the loss of importance of journalism, not only science journalism, but journalism in general. We see a very strong differentiation of communicators who refer to scientific content to gain public attention and acceptance for this position. So not only scientists who talk in the public sphere, but of course also corporations, NGOs, political actors, populists, science skeptics, all these different actors who now are visible and make their voices heard. We see a strong fragmentation of the public sphere. So we know, for instance, from segmentation studies and science communication, that very different parts of the society have a very different approach to science communication. And we can see this quite clearly. And we also, of course, have the influence of platforms and technical developments such as algorithms, artificial intelligence, bots, whatever, which of course also interfere or have an influence on public communication, and of course also have an influence on how science is perceived throughout society. So these both changes can have very different consequences and both opportunities and risks for society and its relationship to science. So examples such as Wikipedia, Reddit, the development of open science or the citizen science movement show that we have greater opportunities for participation and access, and also transparency in society's handling of scientific knowledge. But at the same time, fake news or alternative facts by science skeptic or populist movements show the downside of these developments, and both developments are need action. So to boil this down, we have a high societal importance of science communication on the one hand, and opportunities, but also risks of the digital society on the other. And against this backdrop, science communication quality is becoming central, and ensuring this quality is of increasing relevance for us as scientists, potentially you if you're a science communicator, but also for politics and society in general. So therefore, we've in Rethink asked two things. First of all, we wanted to find out what we actually mean when we talk about good quality science communication, so the name of the workshop basically. And second, we also wanted to know how this quality can be promoted against the backdrop of the changing SciComm ecosystem that Frank also has hinted to. So the question of what good science communication is may sound trivial, but we actually found out that it's not. And this is very, very nicely visualized with a quote by a Swiss journalism researcher, Stefan Roos-Mohl, who once said that the attempt to define communication or journalism, or in our case, science communication quality, is like nailing pudding to the wall. So it's basically impossible. So although this original quote related to journalism, defining quality for science communication is a challenge. So if we have the very broad definition of quality, we can say that's the attribution of values or properties to an object. So in our case, science communication. And when we have a look at the science communication quality research, we can find some definitions, and we also can find some frameworks for science communication quality, but these have been mostly developed in the context of science journalism or science PR. So, and there, of course, are certain professional standards applied, and therefore the question is whether these standards can be really applied to the dynamic science communication ecosystem that we face today. So the problem is that communication quality is always a matter of degree and a matter of perspective, as two quality researchers called Lacey and Rosenstiel put it just some years ago. So accordingly, the quality assessment of science communication can differ massively depending on whether we ask a scientist, a blogger, or a user. So against this backdrop, our question was also not only what quality actually is, but also how we can actually research quality. So what we did was to decide for some kind of meta perspective and to conduct a Delphi study with international science communication scholars and also practitioners. And maybe you know the method. The Delphi study refers to the famous Oracle of Delphi in Greece. And the method uses expert knowledge to reflect on complex questions such as science communication quality, to make assessments or to develop forecasts. So the very distinctive feature of such a Delphi study is that you carry out several waves, in our case, several waves of surveys and focus groups. And for our Delphi, we invited international science communication scholars from a broad range of disciplines, and in the third wave, also science communication practitioners who we addressed as experts on these fields. So what did we find out? Did we really manage to nail the pudding to the wall? So, well, I would say partly. In the first survey, we had asked experts to name quality criteria that they found important, and to analyze our data, we used an approach that is called situational analysis. And this approach works with visual maps, one of them, such a messy situational map you can see here. And they are used to make the elements visible and to order and structure them. And as you can see, we received a huge variety of criteria, which we then ordered, which led to this more structured, but still very comprehensive map. So our problem then was that I suppose none of you would be able to tackle such a framework in everyday practice, that we wanted to boil this down to make it somehow operational. So therefore, our approach was to find a way to make criteria adaptable to everyday work. And therefore, we did two things. We first asked the experts for more generalizable criteria out of all these. And we also developed meta criteria. So instead of juggling with 200 or somewhat criteria, we would like to propose to consider consider meta criteria of science communication. And these are these 4+1 meta criteria that we think should be always the basis when you deal with science communication quality in a digital context. So we distinguished content, so basically criteria that refer to what is communicated, presentation criteria, so the question how science communication is communicated, technical criteria, which become increasingly important because they interact with content and with presentation, and they also interact with context. So basically the question, what is behind the curtains? And then we asked the experts to give us the most, or define the most important criteria out of these extensive lists that we just showed you. And they said, okay, it would be relevance and accuracy for content, accessible language and style, comprehensibility and engaging communication for presentation, opportunities for dialogue and feedback, a big issue in science communication, as you all know, and technical accessibility for technological criteria, and also, and not less important, transparency, clear purpose, motivation, the reliability of evidence, and also the expertise of sources for context criteria. So the process criteria are gray because they somehow have a bit different perspective. Of course, they are also important, especially in professional communication, but they still rather refer to process criteria. So the question whether professional standards are applied, whether communication is evaluated, and so on. So this is a bit distinct from the other criteria. So throughout the Delphi, there was a certain agreement that defining these such generalizable criteria is useful and important. But many participants also stressed that quality assessment always depends on context. So they argued that even these very few criteria couldn't be applied equally to different situational settings. So hopefully Emma will show us that context and science communication can be really different, but still I can try to give you a small overview. So we ask aspects.
So she's
very
here.
good.
Okay,
good. Hi, Emma. Hello back. So what we did was to ask aspects for differences of these quality standards in different situational settings of science communication. So these settings, what do we mean with that? We mean, for instance, a news site of a university. This, for instance, is an example from Germany, the University of Hamburg, which currently faced a scandal around bad quality science communication in the context of Corona. Of course, we have online engagement of scientists, increasingly online engagement of scientists, for instance, on TikTok, but also very different other platforms. We still have science journalism online, although we cannot only talk about science journalism, but need to look at journalism in general, because journalists increasingly use science for their reporting. But also we have very different settings. For instance, governments are talking about science in their health campaigns. This, for instance, is an example from Canada. Or we have posts from influencers or activists. This, for instance, is a quite famous German influencer who often refers to latest scientific studies with different quality standards than probably a scientist would apply. So the question is how quality assessment differs for these settings and which criteria are more or less important in these different settings. And unfortunately, I have to leave this question open because the Delphi did not lead to a clear response how to assess quality in these different situational settings. So this is actually something that we want to address in future research. However, I think important learning and outcome of this is that we have to keep in mind that for both communicators and users, it is a central challenge that quality requirements can differ significantly in different situational settings of science communication in the digital context. So when we discuss quality criteria of science communication online, this is closely connected to questions of how these criteria can be transformed into quality standards. So against this backdrop, we also asked how experts would convey, promote, or even secure the quality criteria that they considered most important. And against this background, Delphi participants agreed that promoting and assuring science communication quality is important. But as this positional map shows, so another kind of visual map that we used for our analysis, they hold very diverse and even contradictory positions on how to promote, convey, or secure quality standards. So we have again tried to order arguments and have located them on a continuum with direct intervention to secure the quality of science communication on the one hand and self-regulation on the other, and with incentivization in between the poles. And another distinction was made between formal and informal approaches. That is what you see on the left-hand side. So while some considered stronger regulation or self-regulation of platforms as important, as we see in some countries already, most participants emphasize that it's important to raise the awareness of quality issues in science communication, especially in the communities of practice. So this is why we are here today, but also in society as a whole. And maybe it's not surprising, but still important that experts see a very strong role of professional science communicators also as role models, and the need for more interaction of science communication, research, and practice. So to conclude, our research, from my perspective, brought some responses, but also many open questions. And my two major points that we maybe also can pick up in the discussion later on are, first of all, how can we develop standards for evaluating these new and maybe not professional settings of science communication, so beyond science journalism or science PR? How can we approach these settings? And this also raises the question, who should actually develop such standards? Should we actually develop such standards? I would say yes, but maybe you have another position. And also, if we acknowledge that all these different and diverse forms are important for our perception of science, how can we then raise awareness of new communicators such as bloggers or influencers and all the other actors, and of course also of the users to promote quality science communication? Thanks for your attention.
Doreen, I think you were going to just show the Slido briefly so that I could link that
Yes.
in.
Yes.
And yeah.
Do you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Good.
So
if...
what I was going to then pick up with after Virta's presentation about quality is to think about the different kinds of actors that are visible in the science communication landscape. And one of the reasons for the initial exercise was for us to just get you to sort of think about the different kinds of actors who contribute to science communication. And we can see a really good range of different kinds of people who might be contributing content digitally. So we do have the kind of more academic end of things, the sort of researchers, scientists, the kind of creators of knowledge, of scientific knowledge. But we also have a really broad range of different kinds of more practitioner focused roles, both in terms of kind of what we might call classic communication roles, the sort of communications officers or science communication support to large projects, journalists, science writers, but also some of the newer roles, so social media producers, social media managers. And that's the sort of territory that we've been looking at in our part of the Rethink project. So Dorina, if you can stop sharing, I will share my screen. So I need to acknowledge my colleagues who've been undertaking this work with me. Elena Milani is our research fellow and has been doing quite a lot of the work on the mapping study. Andy Ridgway, who's here today, and was going to be my backup presenter if I couldn't get back in. So thank you, Andy. And Claire Wilkinson, I think, is also here today, who co-directs the Science Communication Unit at UE with me. So just a little bit of background in terms of our work on the project. We've been looking particularly at digital science communication within the Rethink project, and one of the things that sort of prompted that is this notion that the landscape in which people are getting their scientific information has really changed over the last decades, with the majority of people around the world able to access the internet in some form, and a lot of the information, particularly in kind of Europe and North America and South America, coming through via the internet, a lot of people's access to information on science and health. So Brian Trench, who's also in the room, I believe, pointed out some years ago, and I think it's really a really nice point that he's made, that journalists are really no longer the principal arbiters of what scientific information enters the public domain and how it does. There are so many more actors who are participating in this space these days. And so that's what we set out to look at in the Rethink project, in our part of the Rethink project. We set out to investigate who was visible. So not just who's contributing, but particularly who are the visible communicators. So who are most visible when you search for a piece of information online in the digital space. And we, of course, can hypothesize who those people might be. They might include broadcast media, they might include institutions and science museums and so forth. But there can be, and in fact, there probably are, a large number of other people who have gained high visibility within this landscape. So we set out in our deliverable 1.1, which was about mapping, just to understand who is visible out there, where are they visible, so what media, what social media, what digital media are they using, and what forms do their communication take. And in particular within Rethink, we focused on 3 areas. We've looked at healthy diets, artificial intelligence, and climate change. I'm not going to be able to present all of the data today, so I'm going to just focus on healthy diets and climate change. In doing the research, we identified a rigorous process for gathering information. So we searched on particular digital outlets. We worked with collaborators in the 7 countries that are working with us on this project. So they were searching in their native languages. We asked them to check what content users are sharing. We asked them to ensure that the content matched the topics that we were looking for, etc. So we developed a protocol which was then deployed in each country by our partners, and then that information was brought back together by the team at UE and then analysed to see how the landscape differs across the 7 countries that we were looking at. And just very quickly to give you a sort of top line picture of how this changes. What we can see here is if you look at the 3 topics we looked at, while there might be some initial sort of similarities between healthy diets and artificial intelligence, climate change looks really very different in terms of the types of organizations that are visible. So we see with both healthy diets and artificial intelligence a lot of input from media, whereas media seem to be much less present or much less visible in the climate change discourse. So that's why for today I've decided to have a look at just 2 of these, but climate change and one of the other ones, healthy diets. So when we look at this, we looked at 6 countries: the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Serbia, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. And we asked our partners to just to identify the different kinds of organizations that were visible in their digital space. So this is broad brush looking at the different platforms that they looked at. Who is it who's visible on those different platforms altogether? And you can see that there are some similarities, but there are also quite a lot of differences. We do see non-governmental organizations present across countries. We do see academics present across countries, but not particularly visible in Serbia. They're particularly invisible in Serbia. And likewise, non-governmental organizations were relatively invisible in Portugal. Other groups of people, which we might call sort of the non-professional group, the group that didn't have a clear tie to a science communication industry of some sort. So they weren't journalists, they weren't working for academic institutions, or they just appeared to be doing this because they were interested. And those groups, they weren't visible in Portugal or particularly in Sweden, but were quite visible in the other countries that we looked at. So let's just dive a little bit deeper into 3 of these countries, and first of all have a look at what did this look like for the Netherlands. So the Netherlands had quite a big dominance of NGOs and CSOs, so non-governmental organizations, but the pattern through which these organizations were visible, the different kinds of platforms they were visible on, does vary. So we can see here that when it comes to websites, NGOs, activists, and media are quite prevalent. But when we start to look at some of these other platforms, the prevalence changes. So media becomes much less visible, and the activists, the NGOs, become much more visible. If we look at Sweden, the pattern's again different. So again, we have this dominance of the NGOs and the activists, but relatively little prevalence from the media. So the media here is really only visible on websites and a little bit on Twitter. And then finally, if you look at Serbia, we see much more evidence of the media. So the media is much more prevalent, and it's prevalent across all the platforms. So here we have media contributing and visible on YouTube, Twitter, blogs, Facebook, and websites. And again, the NGOs, the activists are prevalent, but to a relatively lesser extent. So how does this then change for something like healthy diets? Now, not all the countries looked at healthy diets. We found that countries looked at 2 of the different topics at their choice. So most of them chose to look at climate change, but 4 chose to look at healthy diets. That was the UK, the Netherlands, Italy, and Serbia. And again, here we see quite significant input from non-governmental organizations. We see, with the exception of Italy, we see quite a high visibility from the academic community. Governmental organizations are a little bit visible, again, except in Italy. In Italy and Serbia, there's quite significant contribution from the media. And again, there are quite a number of people who are communicating about healthy diets, but don't seem to have a sort of professional relationship to that topic. So again, we can have a look at 3 of these countries in detail. So we can look at first Serbia, and we can see that health practitioners are using websites and blogs. In fact, websites the main place where content was found on healthy diets. But we can see again, and as with climate change, the media are using YouTube for healthy diets communication. They're using blogs and they're using websites. So again, pattern is different, and it will be different in the different countries. In Italy, we see a very mixed ecosystem. So unlike Serbia, where we have kind of 3 main spaces where that content was found, in Italy, we have a very mixed ecosystem of websites, forums, YouTubes, Facebooks, Twitter, podcasts, and blogs. And again, we have, the appearance of industry here. Industry is contributing across a number of these different platforms. Support groups, so these are groups that support patients, for example, are pretty much the only ones using forums. That's probably not surprising. They're also using Facebook. And again, we see media prevalent across a range of different platforms here, where we didn't perhaps so much see that in climate change. So remember, this isn't just that media aren't using these platforms in climate change. It's just that they're not as visible as some of the other actors. In the Netherlands, it's perhaps even more of a mixed ecosystem in terms of the range of different actors involved. So again, we have health practitioners who were not prevalent not highly visible in Italy. We have quite a lot of NGO input, industry input, media input, and again, a good range, or a broad range of different platforms that are being used. So what do we see then when we look at this picture across countries? If we look at the countries and the topics, we see that there really is a broad range of different kinds of actors who are visible in the different countries and in relation to the different topics. So we do see journalists and media. They're consistently present, but they're not always present in large numbers. We see that these non-governmental organizations are perhaps quite good at gaining visibility, and particularly so in climate change. And I think maybe that's not necessarily surprising when we think about the way in which the climate change discourse has developed, but it perhaps gives us some thoughts and some ways of thinking about what we could learn from these organizations. And I think in relation to Birta's discussion of quality, it's quite interesting that this was one of the groups where we struggled to get input from our scholarly community. So I think we see this potentially as a gap, our understanding of how NGOs are contributing to this discourse. The actors differ across the different platforms. Again, that's probably not surprising, but there are things that we might learn again from different actors. So in the healthy diets discourse, we found some really creative use of Instagram, for example, which we didn't necessarily see in the other topics. Within the different topics, the dominance of different platforms changes. Again, perhaps not surprising. I think when we think about something like diet, it's a very accessible topic. When we think of something like climate change, that may be a much less accessible topic. So again, the nature of the actors, the types of material that's shared may change owing to how accessible people find these different topics. So what does that mean for quality? That's what we want to discuss with you in the rest of this workshop. What does it mean for quality if the actors are changing, if the platforms are changing, if the ways in which people are gaining visibility is changing across the broad and diverse digital ecosystem that we have today? So thank you very much. I would just like to finish with a couple of, just caveats, if you like. This was a scoping study. It gives us a really broad picture of who's visible. It sheds a little bit of light on the ecosystem, but there's still really a lot to do. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point.
Okay, Emma, I have 2 questions for you before we take the break. Okay, so the first question is, if the studies were done, I think Eva meant in the local language, or?
They were, yes. So, and in fact, one of the challenges we had as the group looking at English was we couldn't look at Reddit because we couldn't filter out what was British and what was not British or American or Australian or whatever, you know. So we tried not only for the local language, but for what was going on in that country. And obviously with English, it can be a problem because there are many countries where English is a first language, but for Portugal, we were trying to exclude Brazil as well. So really it was kind of what is local to that country.
Okay, another question is, maybe I missed this, but how is visibility assessed? Is it numbers of hits when search terms are used?
It's who's top of the list in your search. So we looked at the top, the people who appeared first on the search. So clean search engines, when you search for that topic, what are the first entries that come up? And we looked for the first 10 in each category. And then for those ones that we identified, it was then a case of looking to see what else were they doing? So what other platforms were they on? So we were looking really for the most prominent actors as the starting point.
Okay, and one more question for Emma, then probably I have one for Birte or still for you. I have to figure it out. Emma, do you have data for COVID-19 information or misinformation?
We didn't. So we started our scoping study before the pandemic and actually rethink before the pandemic. And although within the project, I think Frank may have mentioned, but I missed that bit. We have done a little bit of work on COVID-19. This work we didn't change as a result of the pandemic because it was emerging. And I think it would have been very difficult for us to have said anything very concrete in those early stages when that was going on.
Okay, now I will take the last question because I think there are still a couple of questions, but another question is, does the distribution of the platforms reflect the general use of media in the population? I think this is still for you, right?
So we didn't try to do that. We didn't set out to say what platforms do people use in Serbia. But we did ask our colleagues in each country to be sensible on that in that front. So if a platform wasn't used, they felt that, you know, they weren't finding anything in that, like then they wouldn't include that platform. And certainly in the case of Serbia, there was one platform that is only Serbian, and that was added in. I would hesitate to pronounce it, Krastika, I think it's called, but that was a very specific platform for that country. So each country had a little bit of flexibility to look at the platforms that they felt were interesting. I know the Dutch were really keen to look at Reddit. We would have been keen to have looked at Reddit, but as I said, that turned out not to be possible for us. So there was some flexibility within that to choose the platforms that seemed most relevant.
Okay, so I'll just read the last one very quickly and then we go on the break. We have the break. Was quality accuracy assessed as part of the scope? For instance, healthy eating may bring up the likes of Gwyneth Paltrow. This is
so no, we were looking to see who was contributing to that space, not whether they were doing an effective job in any way, or whether we weren't looking at quality criteria. And I think that this workshop, really what we want to do is to start to bring together these two pieces of work and with your contributions and thinking and discussion going forward to think about what does it mean. So what would it mean to say, you know, there is good quality work on Instagram on healthy diets that doesn't involve, you know, sort of fringe diets, for example. So what would it mean? What would it look like? What do we need to know still? Birte, did you want to add anything on that?
No, yes. No, yes. I think just one challenge in this whole discussion is also to see where science communication ends or starts. So Gwyneth Paltrow talking about her latest diet might not be science communication anymore, but somebody from an NGO who supports healthy diets for children, of course, refers to scientific studies and data and things. And I think this is also in the entire COVID discussion. This is always the problem, that we, of course, have a lot of communication that is not really linked to science, but we also have this science communication. And so this is something that, for instance, Stefan Schäufele and his colleagues, they call it science communication in context. And we really have to tackle which standards to apply in these very, very complex and differentiating contexts. So maybe this is my response to this.
Now it's my pleasure to re-welcome you again for the upcoming expert panel talk that we are having. In the meantime, I just keep on admitting people that are returning for the session. So in the meantime, before we go into the talk, and when people might be still re-entering the Zoom meeting again, I can briefly introduce myself. So hello everybody, my name is Virgil Rerimassi. I am a colleague of Frank Kupper. I also work at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and I'm also working on the Rethink project. And it's my honor and pleasure to host this panel talk that we will be having. And of course, I will also be introducing who will be in the conversation here. And it's very important, of course, to keep in mind that the whole idea behind this webinar series is to open up our research to peers. So from the scholarly community, but also from science communication practitioners. And it's very important for us to learn from your insights and help us reflect on what we are trying to do in this project. So with that in the back of our minds, it's I also want to incorporate you in the conversation as well. So if you have any questions or comments that you want to make, please put them in the Slido. Dorina will also be helping me out by sharing some of the questions for me via WhatsApp on my telephone. So if you see me checking out my telephone, I'm not updating my Twitter or Instagram feed. I'll do that later on, but it's because Dorina is helping me out in that way, because I don't want to go back and forth between all of my different screens, of course. So enough about I'm looking forward to you having your input and your questions as well, and looking forward to make sure that the conversation is also informed by you. So enough about that. So I'd be happy to introduce the experts, the panel members that we have in front of us. So so I'm used to doing this on stage a little bit more. So you kind of have to imagine the applause after all of the introductions, of course. So play that in your mind. So first of all, I'm going to start off with Joseph Roche. Roche, I hope I pronounce your name well. It's always a game when how people pronounce my name. So now I'm the victim who is struggling with that. So Joseph is a researcher and a lecturer at Trinity College Dublin, and he is leading the Science Society Research Group as well as Global Scape, which is a Horizon 2020 research project that is exploring the global state of science communication. So very much related to the type of work that we are doing. So we're happy to have you here. And he has a background in astrophysics and also worked at NASA. So that's pretty amazing. Then next, let's move on to Laura Luna. And Laura has worked in different roles within the communication for the past 20 years. Today, she's leading the press and PR for an organization that is working for a society where alcohol and other drugs do not prevent us from leading a rich and free life. And she is working on making alcohol research readily available and communicate effectively between different stakeholders. And it's also very important for her to raise awareness on the relation between alcohol and violence and cancer, for instance. So, and she has a background in information science and communication. So very happy to have you here as well, Laura. I'm hearing all of the crowds roaring. So moving on to Silvio Mendes, who is working as a social media manager and science communicator at Técnico Lisboa, which is the largest school of architecture, engineering, science and technology in Portugal. And he is a founding member of the Portuguese network of science communicators. And He has a degree in social communication and a master in science communication as well, and also worked as a journalist, so both a scholar and a practitioner. So very happy to have you here as well, Silvio. And again, the crowd is roaring. And finally, of course, we have Beerte Veenweg and Emma Whitecamp, whom you already have met and won't be introducing very much longer. So so I think we have a very nice mix between practitioners and scholarship here. So I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation on what quality is in science communication, and of course science communication in the digital landscape, and whether we should promote quality, and if so, how. So before going into the issue of whether we should be promoting quality standards, I want to start off with Beerte and Emma, with my colleagues, because you're the ones who have been doing this research. And I'm really curious, how do you feel about the quality of online science communication? Beerte, maybe we can start off with you.
I think this is the broadest possible question that you could pose in the beginning. How do I feel? I think so. What might have become clear throughout the presentation was that this research basically maybe led to more questions than we had before, which was quite an interesting observation, because we started with some rather academic, journalistically informed perspective on science communication. And we have, for instance, in science communication journalism and related research, we have these lists where you see, okay, when I'm a journalist and I have to write accurate and objective and blah, 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 blah. But of course, I have also to address certain elements of style, so that people get to are engaged, and then that they are interested, and of course this communication needs to be relevant. So we have that for journalism, and we also have this, for instance, for science communication PR, where you, for instance, say, okay, your communication shouldn't be exaggerating and so on. And we have, for these professional fields, we quite have some kind of discussion. But what was really interesting was also in the interaction with the experts, so the science communication scholars, that even for them it was quite difficult to think broader and to think about the influencer on YouTube, or to think about the NGO who is very active on TikTok or Instagram. And of course they use science strategically to promote their interests. And the question is, how can, because I am, as a user, I see all this. So you pointed this out very, very interestingly in your sense-making research. I see all this and I'm confronted with all this, and now I have to navigate through this. So how can I, as a user, and how can also somebody who is not in the professional science communication context, tackle with these quality issues? Is it really necessary that he does? I would say yes. Maybe you have another opinion. So this is basically, these are the things that now come up, and that we somehow have to deal with it, especially with where we look at the data that Emma just presented, where we really see how many very different actors are involved in these debates around climate change, about AI, about healthy diets, about COVID-19, and so on. And so therefore, this was challenging. Or still is challenging. And
I totally understand, and I think this is very much relates to the issue that you already presented as well, that it's very much context dependent. But I'm trying to get a little bit of feeling of a grips with because your assessment is that the conversation about improving quality is important. So can you maybe share something about what could go wrong if we do not promote quality standards?
So if we assume that being scientifically informed is really important for our everyday decisions, and this actually is the case when we talk about Corona and COVID-19, then people who use science strategically and use counter science strategically, we already see this. So we have a look at the US and the climate discourse there. So now, okay, now it's improving, but previously we have big players, big think tanks who really put a lot of fake science in the public discourse, or who reinterpret scientific data to make them fit to their interests. And if we see that, then this is really not so very good, actually.
Yeah, I was very much intrigued by your remark that that indeed this knowledge society, I think it's a very important concept to have in the back of our minds when we're thinking about improving quality. And you also noted that scientists by now, looking at the corona debate, are turning into pop stars. But we also see the other way around, right? We also see pop stars behaving like scientists. So I think that's an interesting development. Emma, can you comment on what Bertha has been saying?
Sure, I'm going to comment on it in a slightly different way. In that, so I absolutely think that it's important that the information that is available in the public domain is of some sort of good standard of quality. But I think when you start to think about the strategic use of information by actors who have their own vested interests, and we need only think about a certain former president in the US, which because I'm here at the moment, I keep getting news about, to really see how that's a challenge. And so I do wonder, and it's certainly beyond the Rethink project, whether actually some of this isn't a conversation about what does quality mean for platform owners, so the Facebooks and so forth. To what extent is there a need to have, like you would do with a newspaper, an editorial policy, so I think that's part of the discussion, which is not part of the discussion that we've had really within Rethink. And I think the other aspect, which is part of the discussion that we should be having, is where this sits within education. So thinking about quality isn't only thinking about who is producing the content, but it comes into that sense making. What does it mean for a society to be able to interrogate information and decide for themselves what is quality? And I think that does fit really squarely within the work that we've done. I don't have an answer to that, but I think they are two parts of the quality dynamic that are very important from a societal perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emma. I think for me this has been also very important to clarify a bit more what kind of important ideas and thoughts are that we are having for the discussion. So I'd be happy to open it up now to our peers in the panel outside of the project. So I wanted to start off with Joseph, because you're also of course a science communication scholar and also involved in a similar EU project with a similar spirit and approach, I would say. So how have the presentations and particularly the quality criteria that we are trying to formulate now, how do they resonate with you? Could you maybe comment on that?
Thank you, Virgil. Yes, it's really exciting to be here today, not just to be with so many people who are interested in this topic and finding time to discuss it, but just to be able to reach the point now with our European projects where we are seeing the results coming from different projects. And as Frank mentioned, this week, in fact, we'll see a lot of the projects with the results emerging in that special issue of JCOM. So I'm going to repeat what Frank said and encourage everyone here as part of this community to look at what's happening in all of our projects and see maybe what your insights could be to help us move forward. So in terms of my own experience of the projects we've been working on, I should mention the Quest project, which I'm a part of, and had a very similar goal in many ways to what has been accomplished with Rethink. And I think what's really encouraging is that we've seen a lot of the same type of things, that even though the type of questions we were addressing, we used different methods, we were getting very similar results as to what is being presented here today. So that on some level reassures me, but also we found, similarly as the Rethink project has, that it's a very difficult question, and we can answer maybe parts of it, but the larger questions are going to take much more time. So in our work as well, we and actually I need to mention Arko Olesk, my colleague from the University of Tallinn, who I think is on this meeting as well, who led the work for the Quest project. He was developing indicators of quality that we could use, and I think we've come up with indicators of quality that resonate exactly with what's Rethink has found. And similarly, we found that it's probably best to have quite broad indicators to use, but then they need to be adapted for specific areas, specific parts of the community, because we're all working in slightly different ways. So my own role was trying to adapt them to the museum sector and how we communicate science within that space. And I think that's been interesting, seeing how maybe we have similar ideas of quality from different areas of science communication, but how that is realized in practice can be quite different. And I think that is okay, although people may disagree with me, but that's my my views, Virgil.
Well, maybe you could follow up, because there was a question, it might have been from your colleague, because we had a question: do you think we should set official quality performance indicators across contexts, contents, technologies to help audiences distinguish quality science communication?
That's a really good question, and I think personally I would like to think it's worth trying, but I'm not sure if it's definitely something we should or shouldn't do. So maybe I can put that to the community. If you like, I can drop into the chat a link to our indicators for the museum sector, and maybe professionals, scholars and practitioners in that space can then decide for themselves and choose, is it something that would help, or is it something that maybe we should be trying something else.
Interesting. Thank you, Joseph. We can follow up on this maybe. Let's move on to the from the perspective of the practitioners, because I'm really curious how these quality standards that we try to formulate, how they resonate with you. Laura, maybe you can kick us off.
Yes, hello. If I may start, I had a little question to Emma about the healthy diets. Did the healthy diets include anything about alcohol intake or not?
I don't think I can answer that directly, in the sense that we searched for content on healthy diets. We didn't specifically look for alcohol, so we weren't looking. I think it was a sort of broader picture. I would imagine that within healthy diets, alcohol consumption would fall within that. It would do in many contexts, but yeah. It wasn't a specific.
Yeah, well, because that is a bit of my starting point. When you look at science that has to make the people do something themselves, to be responsible of their own actions, it's very much more difficult to communicate. And one thing that I saw when I started working with the temperance movement 4 years ago was that it was very difficult to get into media. Every time I wrote an opinion piece, I had to bombard with all the sources because they thought I was faking. So what did I do then? We had a lot of reports on science that we couldn't really get out because people didn't want to believe. They don't want to believe that alcohol could give you breast cancer or that kind of stuff. And that's science. But they do want to read about a Mediterranean diet with a glass of wine every day will make you live forever. So my challenge when I started to work with science communication was, how would I make science click-worthy in media? We don't have so many medias in Sweden as you might have in some other European countries. It's a very little space, and where all the NGOs want the same attention, and we don't always have the means as some big companies have. So for me, it was a lot of taking the science that I got, because we had really good scientists making all this alcohol reports that can look like this is the last one about alcohol and COVID. So for me, it was taking what that is saying and making it, wording it into an easy and click-worthy click-worthy communication. So, for instance, I remember when we did about alcohol and violence. One of the things that we translated and made our saying was 3 out of 4 punches are made under drunkenness. That was much more easier to communicate than saying, well, it is 78% out of all the police cases of assault. So we had to be creative and communicate something, re-communicate, make it interesting, and at the same time make it click-worthy in order to have a possibility to make it readable. And the same thing by making short messages about the science, we could then take them into our web page and to read the whole report. But it was about making non-alcoholic life sexy, and that is not always easy. As for instance, if you would say non-alcoholic, that's quite boring. But if you said liberated from alcohol, it's a completely different way of communicating. So yeah, for us, talking about for the temperance movement, talking about science, it's a lot about remake our communication, and of course always asking the scientists, because they have the last word always.
So I think this is a very interesting point, Laura, because what you're describing is you have a challenging message to convey, right? And in order to have an impact, it needs to be click-worthy, as you said. It needs to be interesting, and of course, it needs to be scientifically accurate. So, having said this, and Beerten just in the beginning of the webinar, of course, presented the set of criteria relating to context or presentation or technology that is used and so on. How do you see any added value of the framework that we are trying to develop, and your thinking and reflecting and maybe future development of communication outlets?
Absolutely, I do think so. I think that universities actually should work more actively with teaching students how to communicate science, because it's not easy. It's not something you just do in a little while. It's very difficult making the very scientific word into something that people can use on an everyday talk.
Yeah.
We do know that smaller groups or minorities, they don't always understand what they're saying at the news. So they will click into an NGO and they will search for other information.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, we had to make it available even in how we speak.
Yeah. Thank you, Laura. That's I'd be happy to come back to that. But for now, I'm also really curious, of course, how our other fellow practitioner, Silvio, is thinking about this. How does the framework that we're trying to develop, how does it resonate with your work?
Hey, thank you for the invitation. It's very, very important to me to be here discussing these issues, not just doing the work, but reflecting and rethinking what we've been doing in science communication. Maybe I'll point out more problems than solutions. So let's discuss some of these. I usually agree with what was pointed out in this work, and I'm happy to understand that my values and the practice that I already had fit in these categories that were being presented by this project, and also by Quest project that has been very important to the work I have been done. We are recently in our institution at Técnico Lisboa, we have been creating a social media playbook for our internal community, for our social media practitioners. And and a lot of these ideas are they fit in what the work we are doing for social media too. So this is a good signal for me, and I'm very interested in this conclusion. So this also is kind of gave us kind of empowerment, because we usually have to discuss this, how to communicate internally in our institution. So we have to talk with our researchers, our academic community, and a lot of people that made part of our institution. And when we have studies and we have this kind of project showing that the conclusions, it will be, of course, very important to us to share and convince and empower all of our community. So this is all these questions about accuracy, presentation and style, clarity and transparency, the impact of science, scientific communication in society. All of this is very important in everything we do when we communicate science. So this fits completely in the work we try to do, at least in our institution, and also in Portugal in a lot of institutions. So I don't know if it was what you wanted to.
No, this is very, for me, it's very important to learn that whether what we are coming up with, what we are finding as academics, whether it makes sense and is helpful for practitioners. So that's motivating, right? So I'm gonna switch it up a little bit, because we have to be mindful of the time actually already. So I want to ask all of the panel members to try to be as brief as possible in the responses. We had a very important a question in the Slido as well that very much relates to what I wanted to ask as well. And it said that a lot of misinformation is presented in great quality media. So how can we use communications quality to battle the spread of digital misinformation? So what role has quality to play here? I'm just going to open it up. So whoever wants to comment, be my guest.
Well, for us, it was a matter of sometimes we couldn't even get in with a complaint on the media, so we had to answer in a web page and make it clickable. Mm-hmm. So we used our website and spread it through social media to answer when misinformation was spread on mainstream media.
Maybe I can try a response. Yeah, thanks for the question. I maybe rather want to pose another question, because we always talk about fake news and alternative facts and all these bad and evil things, but I think we also should have a look at people who use science because it's just fancy, or so this general scientism that we find, for instance, among influencers or among political actors, who of course just refer to a study because it's just easy to legitimate what you say, and it's just standard to just cite some scientific sources. So I think somehow we are also in a position where we also need to be very careful with these actors who are, of course, not opposing science or skeptic or whatever, but science communication has just become some kind of fashion and some kind of style, and I think this is also a risk that we often do not see. And the second thing is that maybe also responds a bit to what Laura just said. That's a very interesting example that you just gave from an insight from your work on alcohol and alcohol communication. I think one problem is always, and I think this is something that practitioners are facing sometimes, to deal both with quality requirements and effectiveness. So effectiveness and quality are not necessarily the same, but of course they have to match somehow. And in your perspective, or from your example, I think we see this quite nicely. So 4 years ago, I did interviews with NGO people from Canada who were in the environmental sector, And they said, okay, what they try to do is, because there's a fast food chain that is called Tim Hortons, I think, and they tried to Tim Hortonize their scientific info, so to make them understandable for people, to make them as simple as possible. And I think this is, of course, it's important, but of course it's also a risk. So, and I think it's all a question of balance in the end.
In the end, it's the communication professionals' work to make the science referable for media and for other stakeholders.
Yeah, I was thinking that we have to have a strong science communication, because if you leave the field to that new actors or that fake news actors, we are just not playing the game, and we are just losing in the beginning. So you have to be strong in strong projects of science communication. We have to fight for having that. We are in different levels of I believe that there's a lot of people from different countries here, so we are in different levels. And for some countries this is not an issue at all, but in some societies it still is. We still have to fight to have a strong science communication community. In Portugal we are doing that, and we are doing that very, very strongly. In the last years we have developed very, 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 very much, and we have to never forget that we have our stories, our scientists, and our science that are unique, where we have sources that anyone else has, and this is a huge potential that you have to use. So we have also scientists that are working scientifically to fight this kind of misinformation and this kind of fake news. For instance, in our institution, we have scientists that are collaborating with a TV show that is a fact-checking TV show. They are interested in fact-check some of the internet videos that are seen by thousands of people. And also we have projects to monitorize hate speech online. And we have to do this double standard. We have to communicate very well. We have to have a strong science communication, at the same time to show how science itself can help in these questions.
I want to pick this up, Silvio, because I'm very intrigued by this issue of strong science communication. And I was wondering, and then we also have to already begin to move towards wrapping this conversation up already. To what extent does fostering, promoting quality standards, the type of standards or that these types of Horizon 2020 projects are working on, how does that help in making stronger science communication? Will this help us win the war against, so to speak, against people who do not abide to quality standards, because they are but communicating about scientific topics nonetheless? Emma, go ahead.
Kick off on that one. So a little bit cynically, I think there are always going to be people, and I think Laura has to deal with this a lot, who want to hear certain messages or don't want to hear other messages. And so I think that when we talk about quality standards, what we should be seeking to do is generally raise the level of the discourse. But I think we have to accept that that isn't going to get rid of misinformation or it's not always misinformation. It's often just not quite correct information. And so I think, I think there is a need to recognize that will always exist. And in some areas that is going to be very problematic because it has huge impacts on society. So vaccination, for example. Yeah. In other areas, it may be more of an impact at an individual level. Either way, it's not a good outcome, to have people making poor choices. How do you tackle that? I mean, some of that has to be, I think there was a question about critical thinking in the slide out. That has to be through addressing critical thinking at a more societal level. So I do really think that strengthening the quality of information, encouraging people to think about how they're using information is hugely important, but it has to go hand in hand with some sort of increase in public critical thinking ability, so presumably through education.
Thank you for this, Emma. I want to move towards wrapping this up, and I want to do this in 2 stages. So first of all, I want to ask our external guests outside of the scope of the project to do 2 things. First of all, I would like to, what's the overarching take-home message that you have after this webinar? And second, what advice do you have for Rethink and maybe our fellow projects as well, like Quest, to promote quality standards if we indeed want to pursue this? So who wants to go first? Go ahead, Joseph.
Thanks, Virgil. Yeah, I guess my overarching feeling from this session is like quiet optimism. I guess I'm usually optimistic at most of the time anyway, but I think the way Emma and Berta described the work has certainly encouraged me, and I really like the idea of the nailing the pudding to the wall image, because I mean it is something we're all trying to do, and we're tackling in different ways, and there's going to be parts of it that are very difficult to do. And like Emma has said, education is going to be key to this, and that again leaves us lots of other challenges. I mean, the way that misinformation and disinformation changes and adapts in an online world is very fast, and certainly parts of education, and particularly I think of my own university and how we adapt to teaching things and helping provide information is very slow. So I guess my recommendation for Rethink and for the other projects and for any of us who care about this community is that we probably do have to keep coming up with creative ways and new ways of trying to address these problems, because the problems are changing and we can't just rely on the old methods of tackling them. So I think this is a really nice step to be having the conversations, and maybe when we're sharing our work, we just ensure that it's open and accessible and that everyone can be part of that conversation, and hopefully that'll be one way of tackling it. Although, you know, I'm optimistic, so maybe that sounds very naive, but that's how I feel.
Well, here in The Hague, the sun is getting through now, so I'm feeling the same sense of optimism. By the way, if we're talking about the way that you are, or your technique and presentation, having a Roomba cleaning your living room in the meantime certainly adds to the scientific quality of at least tone of voice of your contributions. Thank you, Joseph. Let's move on to our other panel members. Silvio, please.
Yes, I would say that an important message to take home from this session would be the never stop thinking about the quality of the work that we are doing, and trying to, and never stopping paying attention the new actors and the new communicators that always show up, but at the same time never lose the conscience about the work we are doing, and what are our main message, our characteristics, and what are our audience. What I would like to this project to do, or a suggestion, is that the delivery can be that this project doesn't stop here. So we need to get this message, this framework to more people, not just to some science communications or some the people that made part of the study, but also creative forms of sharing this with the community. Maybe the countries that are part of the project can do some training sessions or translate the document and or publish the book. I don't know, but let's start this thing in a very specific thing that we can share with our communities, scientists, our science communicators, our future science communicators, and that's what I would suggest. Yes.
Thank you, Silvio, and it's a very good point. I was also thinking about how we, when communicating about the framework, we can actually draw inspiration from the framework itself. So, there was a great point mentioned in the Slido as well, that we should also think about this extended ecosystem that is indeed present in the current science communication landscape. So we should also think about NGOs and governments and that type of organizations, and see if we can engage with them as well, because they are in fact also from a certain perspective also science communicators. So thank you. Then Laura.
Yes, well, my take on this, my advice would be to work on the communication and be better than the misinformation trolls. So it is about all the time being and trying out new ways, because most of the times we don't have the same resources as like some companies have to spread their word. So it's about finding the best way of being better than them and use their methods. Why not? If you can create great communications out of science, you'll always win. And use NGOs and those kind of organizations, because they are very often more credible than a company. So yeah, that's my take.
Thank you, Laura. And I always try to formulate one quote for me as a take-home message, and I think we have to be better than the misinformation trolls. That's my quote of the day. So thank you very much for your contribution, and also for this quote. Then I would like to finish off with my colleagues. First, starting with Emma. What is your main take-home message? And then finally, Beerte, as the chief investigator of Rethink on this topic. Emma.
So I think from the conversation that we've had today, that the challenges of contributing in this space, when there is so much noise, and particularly if your message doesn't want to be, it's not a message that wants to be heard, I think that's a real challenge in terms of thinking about quality. If you're trying to challenge misinformation, which is more popular, that's a really big task. So I think quality is hugely important, and something that we really need to keep keep an eye on. But I think just recognizing that it may be an uphill struggle sometimes.
Thank you, Emma, also for grounding us indeed, because we can be there's enough reason to be optimistic, but we have to be optimistically, realistically, I would say. Thank you, Emma. Well, Beerte, the floor is all yours. I'm really curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks. So maybe I can pick up one of the last comments of the Slido. Somebody said that we should get out of our own audiences, and I think he or she is right. We need to get out of our bubble, because I think the SciComm community is still a bubble, and I think we meanwhile managed to get practice and research closer, which is really good, and I hope that this will develop even further. But still, I think we are still a very somehow in many perspectives a somehow closed community, and I think engaging with, for instance, NGO people who don't think of themselves as science communicators, but who in fact are science communicators, is really important, for instance. So I always refer to NGOs because I've been working with NGOs. And so I think this should be something, maybe this could also be something for our Horizon 2020 projects and the projects to come in the next framework, that we really have to address people outside of the community and to engage them and to make them think and reflect and rethink what they are actually doing. And so from my perspective, so when I talk to people from Greenpeace or all the other NGOs, they are really open for this, and they are also, so oftentimes these of course are scientists, but often they are not, and being scientifically informed, being an expert in their field is really important for them. So they really care about these things, and to engage with them and make them complices is really important. So, and this would be my message and my take-home message. And yeah, thanks to all of you for this great discussion.
Yes, similarly, and indeed, Beerte, I mean, we are going to work on these topics, right? So it's looking forward to this. Thank you for all of the participants. Thank you. Sorry if I haven't been able to include everyone's comment or question in the Slido. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I feel very much inspired to pick this up in the Rethink project and beyond. So thank you very much. Looking forward to the third Rethinkers webinar that will be taking place, I think, in September. But I think that Dorina might be saying something about this. I'll hand back the microphone, at least figuratively, into you. Thank you for this. Take care.
Okay, so thank you very much, Virgil. Thank you very much, Emma, Beerte, Joseph, Silvio, Laura, and of course, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for your patience. We had also excitement during this workshop, but this is the beauty of live streaming. So I think we got used to it. Before closing, I would like to remind you of 3 things. Number 1 is we are going to render the video, the recordings of this meeting available. We are going to edit it a little bit, right? Because we had this important excitement, so we are going to render it quite attractive. So you will find it online. If you want, you can find the Delphi study that Beerte was talking about right here. I sent it in the chat already, and also other outcomes of the Rethink project that also Emma and also all the other colleagues in the Rethink team already came up with. And number 3, of course, is our third and last workshop of this webinar series. We are going to talk about equity and inclusion, and we are going to do it with Andy Ridgway from the University, a colleague of Emma from the University of the West of England, and also another colleague, I think it's Claire Wilkinson, right? And stay tuned, we are going to announce the date hopefully in a while, and we hope to see as many of you as possible. If you are interested in other things, please, thank you. We are happy to see it. It was wonderful because it was challenging as well. If you want to get in touch with us, I sent the website. You can find our emails, and let's hope we keep on being a community. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.